Well, I hope I'm not going to disappoint our journalists, because the reality is that having presented my report, which I'm sure many of you have read, we're now in what I consider to be the very important process, because the reason we table these kind of initiative reports is we want to have debate, discussion. That I have to do with my colleagues, and both Clintz is here from the ALDE group, who's a very key member of our committee, is that we really want to have the possibility then to look at other alternatives, maybe to answer some of these questions. So I don't have the monopoly of wisdom in this area, and I'm waiting for my amendments to come in on Monday. And then perhaps after that I could have given you a better idea of where the committee and different political groups sit on this issue. But I think the one thing that we can say from your introductory comments, Daniel, is that the culture, we don't believe, has changed. I think we all agree on that. That we've continued to see crises, scandals. We've continued to see issues like LIBOR, mis-selling. We've not got away from banking bailouts. We've seen the situation in the Netherlands where a bank had to be bailed out very recently. We've seen the emergence of another banking crisis in Cyprus. I'm reluctant to take anything definitive from that crisis because, of course, the Cypriot case is a very unique case. It is a unique case in terms of how that country promotes itself as an offshore financial investment centre with low taxes and attracting investment from across the world, and predominantly, of course, from Russian depositors. So it's not something that we can draw parallels from or draw conclusions from. Nonetheless, I think it is another example of why we need to look at the issue of reform in more detail. And what the situation in Cyprus does show is that banks are still too big to fail. And that really is a consideration for us that is important. The IMF estimated in 2011 that the Cypriot banking sector was 835% of GDP, and that bank assets in relation to GDP had tripled in size since 2000. Mario informed me this morning that across the EU, the banking sector actually accounts for 375% of EU GDP. So this is a very important sector, without a doubt. And that's why, in many ways, we have to get it to function well, to function efficiently, to have that kind of stability that we need to have. And that is why I know many of you will say we've had a tsunami of rules and regulations, and I've heard this from many of my colleagues. When will this end? We've had CRD3, CRD4, we've had the regulation around hedge funds, market abuse, which again I'm working with my colleague Mr. Clintz on. So, I understand in some cases in some cases frustration and the amount of work that banks have to do at the moment to react to this kind of and to implement the new rules that are coming forward. But I would argue that a banking structural reform is complementary to these rules and is actually much more fundamental than simply changing rules of operation, operational rules as opposed to culture and structural reform. And of course, how we then carry through that reform is a question indeed for my report, for the amendments that are made to that, to the discussions, and indeed to what the Commission will then bring forward probably in the summer in terms of its proposal. But I do think that we are agreed in my committee on a number of core issues, and that is that we have to make sure that any reform that we undertake is the first line of protection has to be for depositors and savers. While risky trading activities, it's good to take risk. Nobody is against taking risk. This is what generates profits and generates returns for organisations. But excessive risk we don't think is good, and excessive risk which has led to some of the problems and crises that we've had in the sector is obviously not good, because the government and taxpayers are still paying the price for that. And that is the other part, I think, where we agree on, that it's wrong that depositors and savers should have to bear the costs of a bailout and the cost of saving banks from collapse due to reckless activities, not risky activities, but reckless activities. And that's why you will also have seen such a massive outcry from the Parliament's committee when the first response from the Cypriot government was to say that depositors and savers should actually pay the cost for those mistakes. And again, of course, that changed in the final bailout deal. But it's wrong that every time something does go wrong, the first line of defence we don't believe should be savers and depositors. nor should it be governments or taxpayers that have to do that job as well. So as I said, we do think that this bank reform is an order of magnitude that is different. It is necessary because we continue to experience crises and we continue to experience problems in the sector. We do want to put in place some proposals that will stop banks from being too big to fail. Of course, we also want to look at the long-term sustainability and health of the sector. Some of us don't believe that there should be a distortion in the banking sector, unlike other industries where there is a guaranteed, implicit guarantee and an implicit funding subsidy that's guaranteed irrelevant of what activities you undertake. And of course we do want to have a reform that reduces the probability of bank failure, the likelihood of government intervention, and actually would reduce the cost of government intervention. And I note that while we await the impact assessment from the Commission, one of the arguments that the banks use for why we shouldn't have any form of separation or ring fencing between retail and investment activities is that the costs will be too high. But I would be provocative in saying that those banks don't seem to have a problem with the costs that we have to pay as taxpayers or savers when things do go wrong. So you can't have it both ways. And so then I think, I don't want to go into detail of the proposals because I think all of you will know that in a lot of detail. What I do want to really touch on is this issue about the other reason why we think we need to have reform and some structural reforms is that we do have a fundamental problem of public trust and confidence. And that doesn't go away. We did have a situation where we felt that confidence was increasing, that banks were getting back to a form of business, that people felt that they could trust in them. And then we had the LIBOR crisis. And then we had a plummeting of shares. We again had a plummeting of confidence. And the statistics, certainly that I've seen, in terms of the UK, a consumer group, just don't look good. 71% of those surveys don't think banks have learnt the lessons from the financial crisis, and that's up 61% from September 2011. Just 11% of people, consumers, trust bankers to act in their best interests, and only 6% link ethical behaviour with bankers. Only 29% believe that bankers who breach an industry code would be removed from the profession, and that's compared to 78% of people who think that a doctor would be removed. Now, you may argue that health is a life and death situation. I would also argue that the crisis or collapse of a country is a life and death situation for some people because it feeds through into not having a functioning health service and a public debt, which means that services can't be provided. So I do think that there is a big job for the industry to do in restoring that trust and confidence. And I think many of us believe that this is a reform that's necessary if the banks themselves and the financial sector doesn't want to undertake those larger reforms, then we need to bring that forward in a proposal across the EU. The other issue is really why we've looked at this in a way where we've decided let's not miss the opportunity in this discussion to say this isn't just about excessive risk-taking and avoiding bank failure or crisis. It is, exactly as Daniel said, about a more stable banking system. What do we want our banking system to do? And therefore, what structure do you need for it to do that? Of course, we want a stable and more competitive basis. For EU banks, it's got to be based more than just resilience against future crisis and removing those risks from banks to public finances, even though that is essential. We want to have an effective banking system that provides banking services, safeguards deposits, channels savings to productive investment, and manages risk better, thus supporting the real economy and growth, which we think will be exactly the point that you made, Daniel, that how can we get a better contribution to financial stability, but to growth, and that we can actually perform better than we're currently doing. So I think that we think there is a need for structural reform. We do think that some of these problems, you are right, are being addressed in the regulatory reform agenda. But as I've said, we're still experiencing bailouts and problems. We want to restore trust and confidence, and that is low, and that in turn will stifle growth and reduce the impact of stimulus measures. And we also want to make sure that we do prevent public money being used to cover private losses. We want to look at how we limit the misallocation of financial and human resources away from non-bank sectors. And I think we do want to have a look at how we can limit a bank's incentives and ability to take excessive risk with insured deposits. We need to reduce the interconnectedness between the risky elements of banks and the shadow banking system. And as I said, we do think that there needs to be an approach to making sure that we tackle the problem of banks being too big to fail. So then, having said that, of course there are many questions. There are many questions. Do we need a separation? Should we have a ring fencing? Should separation be total or full separation? Should we be banning activities? But I think what I would ask you colleagues to reflect very clearly on is this will happen. There will be a proposal from the Commission and there will be a reform. Because in the absence of that reform, what we are now seeing is that individually member states are taking those actions themselves. So we don't need to talk about Vickers. Vickers is, of course, has been on the cards for some time. I have never said to my colleagues, nor do I think it is the right approach to say that Vickers should be a model for the rest of the EU. We have a diverse banking sector. We have different cultures. We have to find what fits for different cultures. But it is the case that we are now seeing in France and in Germany new banking laws coming forward. The Netherlands is going to produce one. Italy is now looking at this also in some detail. Of course, if we look across the pond to the US, they've also introduced the Volcker rule, which again is a different approach. So I think my message very clearly is that if we don't, or if the industry doesn't want to help us find some constructive approaches to this, it's going to happen in any case. And I think the way to lobby, quite frankly, is not to lobby against it or to lobby to say that we don't need a reform because we have many other pieces of legislation around and this is just one reform too many, because, as I said, it's a different type of reform, and it is a reform that the majority of people on the Liikanen expert group, which, by the way, did include bankers and people with a lot of banking experience, did decide that we needed to take that particular step forward. So I think the acid test perhaps for us will be if they change the culture. We do want to see a culture that is not based on high-risk activities. We don't want to see a contamination of investment banking practices that slip across into the retail sector. And I know that some colleagues, when we had this debate, said to me, well, that doesn't happen, hasn't happened. Of course it happened. It happened in the mis-selling scandal in PPI. It was the same kind of risk attitude, excessive risk attitude, that then was taken into the retail sector. So that's another reason why we don't want the same culture applying. It's as I said, no one is against taking risk. No one's against taking risk in the investment sector or on account. But in reality, we can't afford to do that with deposits, and where we want to ensure that we continue to have people being able to get access to their money, and we don't want to have a run on banks or capital flowing out of countries. The other two elements, briefly, compensation. We don't need to do very much more in this area. Everything's more or less being done in CRD3 and CRD4. However, we do need to scrutinise the proposals, because when we had CRD3, the rules were very clear on an upfront cash bonus, a maximum of 20 to 30%. Then we see that consultations in the UK from the FSA argued that we could have a 50% upfront cash bonus. That is not what the rules said. And there's no way you can interpret a piece of legislation to say very clearly, if you have 20 to 30% cash up front, that 50% is okay. So we will very carefully scrutinise how CRD3/4 is going to be implemented in remuneration. Lending, competition. I would personally like to see much more competition in the banking sector, particularly around lending. I think there are very many exciting proposals now that are coming forward in terms of peer-to-peer lending groups, because quite frankly banks are not lending, and the arguments may be that our capital requirements mean that we can't lend as much. We still have to pay bonuses and high salaries, so therefore we can't lend. So that is why I would personally like to see more organisations getting in on this market, lending more and using the equity that's out there. People do want to spend money and invest. Let's match these together and get more lending into small business and into the public sector as well. Different types of banking structures, cooperatives, building societies. We want to promote all of those in this report. And of course, fundamentally for me, switching and portability. I think consumers need to be able to switch their accounts around if they want to. That, I think, will make banks more effective and more eager to hold on to their customers and business and give them a better deal if they know that they can switch easier. So I think I've said enough.